So, Lone Rider here, and as a cyclist, this is something that has happened to me before. If you're a cyclist, it's probably happened to you too. Um, this is not uncommon. I was talking to somebody today, and a discussion came up about cycling, and the person was curious about bikes, and he said, knowing that I've been an avid cyclist, he said, "Oh, how much does your bike cost?" And it's kind of like they want that one elusive answer for everything, and I guess I can kind of understand it in a way if you don't know what you're talking about, because or if you're a novice on the subject, because um, a lot of times for many things, economic cost is an indicator of you know um, quality of value. That the more the more highly we value something, the more highly we regard something, the more we're willing to pay for it. So stuff that's cost an arm and a leg, or a lot of money at the very least, is usually of better quality than stuff that costs much less, right? I mean, think about it. What's probably made to a higher standard, uh, an Omega or a Casio, right? If you're looking at wristwatches, what's probably made to a higher standard, right? A BMW or a Toyota. Now, of course, it depends on the model of Toyota. I mean, there are cheaper BMWs and there are really expensive Toyotas. But generally speaking, right, well, which is probably made to a higher standard. And now that's not always the case, and it's not always a case of, what somebody will find satisfying or even ultimately reliable in the long run. A lot of times, things that are costly are in fact better made and have more details put into them, and the fit and finish may in fact be better, but sometimes they also have problems, right? And even if they don't have problems, there's also the question of everything is a trade-off, right? um, so there may just be a question of you want something that's lighter, but okay, you have to sacrifice durability in order to make it lighter. This is true with bicycle components. This is true with cars, right? I mean, what's the biggest way and easiest way to make a car, you know, lighter, and therefore, it's going to get better gas mileage and seem to perform better and so on and so forth? Well, you take out some of the stuff that makes it heavy, right? But then you are maybe less protected in the event of a collision. So, there's downsides to everything. The thing with bikes, though, is that you can't just look at it and be like, well, money is a direct indicator of the value of the bike, because first of all, the bikes are very easy to take apart and work on. If somebody's walking around with a Rolex or an Omega, chances are they bought it in one piece. There are guys, way back when I was into vintage watches, more so than I am now, I do remember guys who would get vintage, and we're talking like 1948, so old school vintage, Tudors and Rolexes and stuff, and they would, if something was broke, they would fix it or have it fixed. But generally speaking, the average person is wearing a nice watch. He probably bought the whole watch. He probably didn't buy the movement, buy the case, buy the band, buy the glass, and then put everything together. Could you do that? Yes, if you knew what you were doing. Most people aren't going to do it, right? But with a bike, you can do that. You can buy the frame only. You can buy a used bike and junk all the parts if you want, or sell them, or whatever, and buy new parts, or put on the parts that you want. You can have a bike that's custom made. I mean, this was brazed by a friend of mine at the local bike shop, and it was made just for me. That's kind of a cool thing. Not everybody has a custom bike. What made it a little cooler is we used lugs. I helped kind of plan out the bike. My friend actually brazed it. Of course, a few years later, I ended up actually making a custom bike myself with his help, but which is a little bit different. It's got center pull brakes, really wide tires. It's more of a sports touring bike, Whereas this is more of just a traditional road bike that simply does happen to have clearance for very wide tires. But I mean, it's got like 23s on there now, but you could fit 28s easily, and you could probably go. You might be able to go up to 32s, depending on this. There's a lot of clearance in here, so But I specifically wanted clearance for wider tires on this bike. But not everybody has a custom bike. Okay, this was a little cooler because in addition to the clearance for wider tires, he used stamped steel lugs that were like vintage. They were these old grungy lugs that were in a box of really old bike parts, like from the 50s or 60s. And I cleaned them up with steel wool and shined them up because they were starting, they had some surface rust. And I shined them up, and he used those old school stamped steel lugs that were from some bike shop that probably went out of business 50 years ago. And that's kind of neat because anybody can go out and buy a set of, high-end modern lugs, right? Something like that's like an antique find or vintage. I mean, you can't really duplicate that, which I think is kind of neat. It makes the bike, even more unique. But yeah, I mean, somebody asked me, what does a bike cost? Does that really convey the full value of what it's like to watch a friend of yours make a custom bike for you according to a drawing that you sketched out? Or even more so, what it's like to actually make a bike yourself, like from scratch, like putting the tubes in a jig and brazing or welding them together? No, right? And it's certainly, what that may have cost, whether you're talking about doing it yourself and just buying the tubing and so on and so forth, or if you're talking about a friend of yours actually making it for you. If they're a friend of yours, they probably aren't charging you like retail, and he didn't. What I paid for this bike when it was made for me, it's not what you would pay from a custom bike from an established maker. Now that is because he does this on the side. His main thing is he runs a bike shop, but it's a damn nice frame. It rides really good, and what would you? Well, what did this cost? I honestly don't remember, but I can tell you that what it cost is not an accurate reflection of what it is, what it's worth to me, the significance it has to me, and how much I appreciate how well it rides. And also, how much it cost is not an appropriate indication of what it would cost to replace this, right? If you were to say, okay, you need to have a custom bike created and you want it made with all the features that this had, right? Instead of end caps, you want handmade sheet metal flats braced on the end of this stay here because it's lighter. But that's got to be cut out of a tube, hammered flat, and then braced on. I want you to use vintage lugs, or where you're going to get those, right? I want you to use the wider end of the stays and of the fork blades. So, they're tapered, and you have to curve them yourself, of course, put the curve in. But they're tapered, and you can choose to cut off a little bit of the narrow end or a little bit of the longer end to get the desired length. When they made this, they cut off the narrow end because I'm not slim, and I wasn't slim even back then. And it ended up with this stouter, wider, more robust tubing. It also just looks a little more neat, if you ask me. But anyway, could somebody else make you this bike? Probably, if they were a good custom maker. What would they charge for it? Way more than my friend did, right? And some makers, might not want to do things a certain way. They might say, this is the way I do it, and so, will I build you a custom bike in terms of measurements? Yes. Will I allow you to pick and choose what features it has? Maybe not. Maybe all of my bikes have a, 73 head tube angle or whatever. So here's the deal. Asking somebody what the bike costs is not an accurate, I could tell you what this costs. It won't tell you anything about the bike. But I understand why people who aren't cyclists and maybe don't know that, or maybe aren't avid cyclists, I understand why they would ask questions like that. One, it's, I guess it's an easy and quick and easy way of gauging what, you know, if the person knows what the bike costs, then they know a lot about bikes, presumably. Whereas if they go, oh, I don't know how much it costs, then they're not an avid cyclist. I don't know. But I've got the opposite problem. Even if you ask me about a production bike, not about this. Suppose you ask me about my Raleigh Ravinia, which I think is from like 2012 or something, 2011. Maybe it's a little later. I don't remember. But anyway, it's a Raleigh, and it's, you know, maybe nearly 10 years old, 5 to 10 years old. So if you were to ask me what that cost, what answer do I give? Do I give you the answer what it costs me? Do I give you the answer what it would have cost at the time I ordered it for somebody who wasn't me, because this was special ordered for me by a friend of mine, at a cheaper price? Would it be? Would I answer what it cost after I got done with it? Because I did change some of the parts. I did change, you know. I actually put a whole new wheel set on there, Mavic Open Pro rims, and, you know, 105 hubs and so forth. And then the stock rims went on another bike. And then it had, you know, tires through, the nicer tires on there. And so, yeah, like, should I tell you how much I paid for it? How much I would have paid for it if I didn't get it cheaper? How much the total cost was to me after I paid for it, and then ultimately finished customizing the parts and changing the wheel set and all of that stuff? Or should I tell you maybe what it would cost to replace that today? You know, but problem is Raleigh might not make that model bike now, right? And my friend really isn't a Raleigh dealer anymore. He can still get them, but he doesn't do all that much business with Raleigh anymore. I think the way he put it, they seem to be on their way out. So, you know, could I even get it now? So what does telling the price tell you? Does it tell you how fast it rides? Does it tell you, you know, it doesn't really tell you anything about the bike, right? We think it does, because that is usually a gauge with, you know, cars, watches, TVs, etc., other material goods. You know, the more it costs, usually the more you're getting. You know, you get what you pay for. But asking a cyclist what their bike costs, really, I mean, it doesn't tell you all that much information. And the more you know about bikes and the more you know about cycling, the more likely you are to realize how little it tells you, right? For example, my single-speed mountain bike, I got as a frame only that was used. Somebody used to race at XC. They were getting rid of it, or their family member was getting rid of it. It was changed hands a couple times, came to the local bike shop. He had the frame up there for sale, cheap. It was literally a frame only. There was no fork, no headset, no nothing. I got the frame only. I took it home, and I put parts on it, and eventually I ended up tweaking it until it's where it is now. It's my single-speed mountain bike, my airborne single-speed mountain bike. I have another single-speed mountain bike that's an old Specialized that I actually got for free, but, you know, then I ended up putting a really nice chainring on it, so and some other parts, and changed the tires, and but anyway, yeah, that I got in trade for just doing some work on somebody's bike. But the airborne, yeah, I bought the frame, but the cost of the frame doesn't tell you. Look at the bike, what it is. What did the bike cost me? Just the cost of the frame, which was under $100, because I had everything else lying around, all these old parts and this and that. But then it's like, okay, what about the time, right? I had to spend my time. One of the two disc brakes both didn't fit on there because one of them had a different mount. I had to change it for the fork. The fork was this Manitou R7. It was a nice vintage lightweight air shock fork, but I had to adjust that thing. I had to, like I said, make sure to change the brake caliper for one of the discs. I had to install. This was the first bike I ever installed disc brakes on, and they were used disc brakes, so I was, you know, installing used. And all the parts I had lying around, I made my own chain guard for the front chainring. I had a Surly Singulator chain tensioner thingy that had been on another bike. I mean, most of these parts I had lying around, and some of the parts I had on the bike I actually have changed over the years for other things. But essentially, it's where I decided it was a few years ago, where I liked it, that's where it stayed. But if you look at that bike now, you could not get what that bike is with all the parts on it and how it's set up and how it's tweaked just so for $100. That's what the bike cost me, because all I did was buy a frame only and put it together with parts I already had lying around or that I acquired in trade over the years. Should I tell you, in that case, when you ask, well, what does your bike cost? If you're talking, first of all, which one, right? Because I got a couple. But if you narrow it down to, okay, the single speed mountain bike. Again, which one? I have two single speed mountain bikes, but the airborne, the one you ride off road more. Okay, got it. Well, should I tell them what I paid for it? Should I tell them what the replacement cost would be? Should I tell them what I think it's worth? There's no good answer, because if I tell them what it cost me, I'm not giving an accurate representation of what that bike represents. It's not a $100 bike. If you were to go and try and find a bike that rides that good with those quality parts on it, vintage or otherwise, you'd be looking at a mid to high end mountain bike. Very probably, you couldn't touch anything like that for under $1,200. So yeah, I paid $100 for it. I got lucky, basically. All right, I got lucky that I knew somebody who had some really cool stuff, and they were selling it cheap. And I got lucky in that I had the skills and the parts lying around and the tools to put it together myself. So, yeah. But, and how would you replace a bike like that? Where are you going to get a vintage short travel air shock, right? That's disc brake compatible. I mean, I guess you look around in the used market. Good luck finding one that's intact. Some of these things, it's not a question of, well, what does it cost? Like, you could just go out and buy one. Some of this, the parts were painstakingly collected over a period of years. And, you really have to kind of know what you're doing. And it's part mechanics, and it's part, voodoo or something almost. I mean, you're in some cases, you're putting together parts that weren't designed to work together, or you're taking something that was designed to work in a certain way and you're changing it. The very fact that I'm using a bike that was not designed as a single speed for a single speed, I have to have a chain tensioner. Why? Well, because the rear wheel position on mountain bikes, except for some of the very early ones, was not adjustable. Mountain bikes stopped using horizontal dropouts way before everybody else, way before road and touring bikes. So, yeah, I mean, it's not like you could just go out and buy one, and even if you could, where are you going to get the parts to? It's not like anybody makes a bike like this stock, right? You could just go and say, oh, I want to buy the Trek version of that, or the the Giant version of that, or the Fuji version of that. Well, no, nobody really makes a bike like that. That's kind of why I put it together. Yeah. Same thing with this vintage steel, with this custom bike built using the vintage steel lugs. I mean, where are you going to get something like that? New. Well, a custom frame builder. But he's probably going to charge more than my friend did. So, I understand why people ask what's it cost, but the truth is, it just shows that, you actually don't know what you're asking, because what you're asking, and I'm not trying to belittle anybody, I'm just saying, the more you know about bikes, the more you know how little what it costs actually says about anything. So, Lone Rider out.